The dog was going to die in that ditch if he didn't stop the truck. Leland Hurst almost didn't. It was January, just past 4 in the afternoon, the kind of cold that made the highway shimmer at the edges even when the sun was out. He'd been driving for 6 hours straight from Billings, and the last thing he wanted was to pull off on some gravel shoulder in the middle of Montana and get himself killed by a semi. But then the headlights caught the shape. Something low and dark, half inside a concrete culvert at the lip of the ditch, and his foot hit the brake before his brain had a chance to argue. He sat in the truck for a moment with the engine running and the heater blowing against his face, and he thought, it's probably already dead. He got out anyway. The dog was a Labrador mix, mostly black, with one white ear and a rear leg folded at a wrong angle. Not old, maybe 2 or 3 years, breathing, but not by much. No collar, no tags. Just a dog that had been discarded somewhere on a road that nobody used in January and had somehow crawled into a culvert to die out of the wind. Leland crouched down in the frozen gravel and looked at the dog for a long moment. The dog looked back at him. One eye was swollen shut. The good eye was brown and very still. "All right," Leland said. He carried the dog to the truck. What the people in Heron's Fork knew about Leland Hurst, they knew mostly from a distance. He'd been back 2 years, maybe 3, living out on the old Hurst property east of town where his father had run cattle before the knees gave out and the bank got impatient. The house was plain and kept up in a minimal way. The gutters were clean, the truck was serviceable, but Leland himself was the kind of man who moved through the hardware store without making eye contact, who sat in the back booth at Della's diner, who nodded at people and kept walking. He'd done 3 deployments with SEAL Team 7, 2 in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, and then a 4th tour that nobody talked about and that Leland didn't offer details on. He came home at 44 with a left shoulder that didn't sit quite right and a stillness about him that was different from calm. People in town recognized the difference, even if they couldn't name it. His wife Pauline had been gone 4 years, pancreatic cancer diagnosed in October, and she was buried the following March. They had 19 months together after he retired from the Navy, which was not enough, and which Leland had arranged in his mind as a fact that simply had to be accepted the way a man accepts the weather, without negotiation, without looking at it too long. He didn't talk about Pauline. He didn't have pictures on the walls. He had her coffee mug on the shelf by the window, plain white with a chip on the handle, and that was the only thing he'd kept out where he could see it. The dog changed all of that, though not right away. He got to Heron's Fork's only veterinary clinic 20 minutes after finding her, which meant he ran 2 stop signs and went 45 through a school zone at dusk, and he was not sorry about either. The woman behind the front desk looked up when he came through the door sideways with 80 pounds of unconscious Labrador in his arms, and to her credit she simply said, "Exam room 2, and pointed. Dr. Vivian Chung had been the only large animal vet within 30 miles for going on 11 years, which meant she had also become the small animal vet by necessity, and she was not the kind of woman who startled easily. She came in drying her hands, looked at the dog on the table, looked at Leland and said, "Tell me what you know." Found her in a culvert off Route 9. Rear leg's broken, I think. She's been out there a while. She yours? Leland hesitated for just a moment. She is now. Vivian looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, then turned to the dog. "Okay," she said. "Let me see what we're working with." He waited in the hallway on a plastic chair while Vivian worked. There was a bulletin board across from him, with photos of animals that had been treated there. Mostly dogs and horses, a few cats, and one very angry-looking goat. Someone had tacked a handwritten note in the corner that said, "They can't thank you, but we can." He read it 4 or 5 times without meaning to. Vivian found him there 45 minutes later. She pulled a stool out from the wall and sat down in front of him, which he noticed that she didn't make him look up at her. Fractured tibia, fixable. She's malnourished. Been that way for a few weeks at least. There's an older injury on her right shoulder healed on its own, which tells me somebody had her for a while before they didn't want her anymore. She paused. She's going to be all right. But it'll take time and she's going to need quiet. "I can do quiet," Leland said. "She's going to need more than quiet. She's going to need somebody patient. She's been through something." He looked down the hallway toward the closed door of exam room 2. So have I, he said. He didn't mean it as a plea for sympathy. He meant it as a simple statement of fact. Vivian Chung understood the difference. Come back tomorrow morning, she said. She'll be stable enough to see you. He named her Soot on account of the color of her, and the name suited her in a way that made him feel, just briefly, like he'd done something right. The first 2 weeks were hard, not on him, on her. Soot came home with a splinted leg and a cone around her neck and a set of eyes that watched everything in the room without committing to trusting any of it. She'd been kenneled at Vivian's for a week post-surgery, and when Leland brought her home in the truck, she sat in the passenger seat and pressed herself as far into the corner as the door allowed, her whole body shaped like an apology. He didn't try to pet her more than necessary. He set up a bed for her near the wood stove, which was the warmest place in the house, and he put food and water where she could reach them without walking far. He sat in the armchair nearby in the evenings and read, or didn't read, and let her watch him without making a big thing of being watched. You don't have to decide anything right now, he said to her one evening about a week in. He was reading a Field and Stream from 3 years ago that he'd already read twice. Take all the time you need. Soot looked at him. She didn't wag, she didn't come closer, but after a while she put her chin down on the edge of her bed and closed her eyes, and Leland took that as 6 weeks. Vivian was pleased with the x-rays. She's young, she said. They bounce back. She watched Soot walk a careful circle around the exam room floor. How's she doing otherwise? Eating well, sleeping well, he paused. She's quiet. Vivian glanced up. Quiet how? She doesn't bark. At anything. I dropped a whole cast-iron skillet on the kitchen floor last Thursday. Sounded like a gunshot. She lifted her head and looked at me and went back to sleep. Vivian made a note. Some dogs go quiet when they've been through neglect. It's not unusual. She may come back around. What if she doesn't? Vivian capped her pen and looked at him steadily. Then she's still a dog who needed somebody. And you're still the person who stopped. Spring came to eastern Montana the way it always did. Not with warmth, but with an end to the worst of the cold, which was not the same thing but felt like mercy anyway. The snow receded off the fields in dirty patches, and the creek behind the property started running again, and Leland began taking Soot out in the mornings on a long leash, slow walks along the fence line that let her move at her own pace. She was a careful dog. She moved with her nose close to the ground and her ears up, tracking every shift in the air. When a car passed on the road, she stopped and watched until it was gone. She didn't pull on the leash. She didn't chase the magpies that landed in the fence posts nearby. She was present and contained and entirely her own. Leland thought sometimes that she was the first creature in several years who had made no demands of him at all. His neighbor to the west was a man named Doyle Fitch, 60-something. Recently retired from the county road crew, who had an opinion about every topic and shared it freely with anyone who stood still long enough to receive it. Doyle had noticed Leland walking the dog and taken it upon himself to come over one Saturday morning, ostensibly to return a socket wrench he'd borrowed the previous fall. Didn't know you had a dog, Doyle said, extending the wrench handle first. I do now. Leland took the wrench. Doyle looked at Soot with the evaluating squint of a man who had grown up around working dogs. What's the matter with her? Nothing. She's not moving right. Watching too careful. She's been through something. Doyle made a sound, which was one of about 7 conversational contributions he cycled through. He crouched down and extended his knuckles toward Soot, who looked at his hand with the same measured assessment she gave everything, and then, after a long moment, stepped forward and touched her nose briefly to his skin. Doyle looked up at Leland. He didn't say anything, which was unlike him. She doesn't warm up fast, Leland said. No, Doyle agreed, but she did. He stood up and looked out at the empty field, scratching the back of his neck. Then he said, My wife's making venison stew Saturday. You're welcome to come. Leland opened his mouth to decline. That had been his default for 3 years, the polite deflection, the rain check that never got cashed. But Soot was leaning very slightly against his leg, the way she had recently started doing when she was comfortable, just the faint pressure of her shoulder against his calf, barely there. What time? Leland said. Doyle looked at him carefully, as if making sure he'd heard right. 6, he said. Don't bring anything. The Saturday dinner at the Fitch house was attended by 6 people: Doyle, his wife Marge, their daughter Penny and her husband, a quiet electrician from Billings named Ray, and 2 people from down the road whose names Leland lost track of immediately, but who turned out to be easy company. The stew was good. The conversation moved at a pace that didn't require Leland to carry it. He'd left Soot at home with a chew, and the wood stove turned low, and he found himself thinking about her at odd intervals throughout the evening. Whether she was okay, whether she'd heard a noise and startled, whether she missed him, and then feeling slightly embarrassed at that last thought, as if a man of his particular history was supposed to be above, wondering whether a dog missed him. Marge Fitch set a piece of apple cake in front of him and said, with no preamble, "Doyle tells me you found her on the road." "Yes, ma'am." "Cold night?" "Cold day. January." Marge nodded and sat down across from him with her own piece of cake. She was the kind of woman who occupied space straightforwardly without hovering. "My mother had a saying," she said. "She'd say that the animals we rescue are the ones that were sent to us, not the other way around." Leland considered that. "I'm not sure I believe things get sent," he said. "That's all right." Marge picked up her fork. "You don't have to believe it for it to be true." He drove home along the county road with the windows cracked even though it was cold, and when he opened the front door, Soot was right there in the entryway. Not frantic, not spinning, just there, her tail moving in a slow side-to-side that he recognized by now as the most she offered. He crouched down, and she walked into his arms and pressed her face against his chest, and he stayed there on the cold linoleum for a while with his hand on the back of her neck, not moving. He didn't feel saved. He was not the kind of man who used that word, or who would have found it useful if he had, but something in the long machinery of his grief had shifted slightly, the way a creek changes course in spring, not stopped, not reversed, just finding a new line through the same country. June came, and with it a woman named Adeline Cross. She moved into the farmhouse half a mile east, the one that had been empty since the previous owners sold to a developer who then did nothing with it for 2 years, until Adeline bought it cash at a price that made the county assessor blink. She was 53, recently retired from a veterinary research position at Colorado State, and she arrived with a moving truck, a decade-old Subaru, and a border collie named Professor who was 12 years old and acted like it. Leland met her the way he met most things in his life, because he couldn't quite avoid it. Soot had discovered that the fence line on the east end of the property had a gap that accommodated a medium-sized Labrador traveling at low speed, and one Tuesday evening in June, he followed the gap directly to Adeline's back porch, where Soot was standing nose to nose with Professor in a conversation that neither dog seemed particularly anxious about. "I'm sorry," Leland said from the yard. She found a hole in the fence. Adeline was sitting on the porch steps with a mug of something steaming, and she looked at him over the rim and said, "She's been here about 20 minutes. They've already worked it out." He looked at the 2 dogs. Professor was lying down in a dignified way, and Soot was crouched in front of him with her elbows on the ground and her back end up, which was the first play posture he'd ever seen from her. His chest did something complicated. "Come up and sit," Adeline said. It was not a particularly warm invitation. It was more the natural courtesy of someone with empty porch chairs and no reason to make a stranger stand in the yard. But he went up. They talked for an hour, which surprised him. Adeline was direct in the way that people are when they've spent years in professional environments and stopped having the patience for maneuvering. She asked him what he'd done before, and he told her Navy, and she said, "How long?" And he said, 22 years. And she nodded in the way that acknowledged it without making it the centerpiece of the conversation, which he appreciated more than he could have said. Professor fell asleep with his chin on Soot's back. Neither dog moved. "He's got maybe a year," Adeline said, not looking at him, looking at her dog. Her voice was even. "The vet in Fort Collins said 18 months, but I've known him long enough to know that was optimistic." "I'm sorry. He's had a good life." She said it simply, as if the math was complete. "I just didn't want to do the last of it alone." Leland didn't say anything to that. He sat with it for a moment the way he'd learned to sit with things. "When I found Soot," he said, "she didn't make a sound for almost 3 months." Adeline looked at him. Not a bark, not a whimper, nothing. Vivian Chung, she's the vet in town, said sometimes they go quiet when they've been through enough. Did she come back? Yeah. He looked at Soot, who was still sprawled in the yard with Professor asleep on her. About 2 months in, she started, just a little. She heard a coyote out on the ridge one night, and she stood up at the window, and she let out this one bark, just one. He paused. I didn't know what to do with myself. Adeline looked at him for a long moment. What did you do? Sat down on the floor, he said, right there in the kitchen. Probably looked like an idiot. She smiled then. Not a big smile, but a real one, the kind that reached the eyes. No, she said. That sounds about right. The summer moved at the pace that Montana summers do, which is to say both slow and irretrievable, as if the warm months know they are temporary and hold themselves still to make the most of it. Leland fixed the fence, all of it, not just the gap, but he left a gate latched on the east side that either he or Adeline could open, and one of them usually did. Soot and Professor became companions in the unhurried way of old and young animals who have decided, without drama, that each other's company is acceptable. Professor moved slowly, and Soot adjusted to his pace without being asked. She had taken to watching over him, walking a wide, careful circle whenever he settled down, as if she had appointed herself to a duty she hadn't been assigned but understood anyway. Doyle Fitch, who observed all of this from across the fence during their conversations about nothing in particular, said once, "That dog of yours has settled right in. She has noticed you've had some company lately." He was looking at the middle distance, as Doyle often did when he was saying something he didn't want to appear to be saying. "Neighbor moved in east," Leland said. A long pause. "Good people sounds like?" "Decent," Leland said, which was the word he'd used his whole life for things he'd felt strongly about. Doyle made his sound and looked at the sky. "Then Pauline would have liked a dog, you know," she always said. Leland was quiet for a moment. The field beyond the fence was gold now, late August, and the light was at that angle that made Montana look like something painted. "I know," he said, not saying anything by it. "I know that too." Doyle nodded. They stood there for another minute, which is one of the things men who have known each other long enough can do without it being uncomfortable. And then Doyle said he had to get back, and Leland said all right, and that was the end of it. He walked back to the house with Soot beside him. No leash now. She didn't need it, and he stopped at the porch steps and looked up at the sky for a moment, the way Doyle had. The light was going. The air had the first edge of fall in it, barely there, the way things begin to end before you're ready to notice. He thought about Pauline, which he did every day and always would. He thought about her the way you think about someone who was the best thing in a life. Not with pain anymore, exactly, or not only with pain, but with a kind of aching gratitude that they existed at all. Then Soot leaned against his leg, her full weight this time, and he looked down at her. It was a Saturday evening in September when it happened, and it was Adeline who was there to see it. She had walked over with Professor moving slowly at her side, and the four of them were out in the back field, the dogs loose in the last of the evening light, while Leland and Adeline sat on an overturned stock tank that served, in the absence of actual lawn furniture, as a place to sit and look at things. They'd been talking about nothing in particular, the way they had started to do. Conversations that wandered across weather and local history and the particular stubbornness of the soil on the East 40, and sometimes something real. Professor was resting in the grass nearby. Soot had been ranging in slow circles, nose down, tracking some private narrative in the earth, and then across the far tree line, maybe a quarter-mile out, a pair of coyotes called. One answered the other, and the sound came across the field thin and silver in the cooling air. Soot stopped. She raised her head. Her whole body went still in the way that hunting dogs go still, not afraid, not aggressive, just completely alive to the moment. She stood there for 3 seconds, maybe 5, and then she lifted her nose to the darkening sky and she howled. It was not a bark. It was not the cautious single sound he'd heard that night in the kitchen. It was a full, open, unguarded howl, the kind that comes from somewhere deep in whatever a dog carries in its chest. Ancient and unself-conscious and completely free. It rose out of her and went across the field, and the coyotes answered it, and she howled back, and Leland sat very still on the stock tank and felt something move through him that he could not have named and did not try to. When she stopped, she stood there a moment longer, vibrating slightly, and then she turned and trotted back to where they were sitting and pressed her nose into his hand. Adeline didn't say anything. She had learned, over the summer, that there were things Leland needed to be left alone with for a moment. She looked out at the tree line and gave him time. After a while, he reached over and scratched behind Soot's ears, slow and deliberate, and Soot leaned into it with her whole body. "There she is," he said quietly. Not to Adeline, not to anyone in particular. Just the simple recognition of a thing coming back. The evening they were photographed, they didn't know they were being photographed. Adeline had bought a second-hand camera from the thrift store in town, a real film camera, nothing digital. Because she'd decided in retirement that she wanted to learn how to do things slowly and correctly. She'd been practicing on the landscape mostly, the particular quality of light in the valley at different hours, and occasionally on Professor, who tolerated the lens with the weary dignity of an old man accustomed to accommodating those he loved. That evening, she'd brought it along without much intention. Leland and Soot were in the field ahead of her, Leland walking in that deliberate way of his, hands in his jacket pockets, and Soot ranging wide around him and then looping back, wide loop and a return, as if she were sewing him into the landscape. Adeline raised the camera. The frame was Leland in the middle distance, the hills golden behind him, and Soot in the foreground looking back at him mid-stride, one paw lifted, ears up, just a man and his dog in a field at evening. Nothing about it was remarkable except that it was entirely, quietly true. The shutter clicked. She didn't tell him right away. She wasn't sure why, maybe because some things need time in the darkroom of your own thoughts before they're ready to be seen by anyone else. She got the film developed 2 weeks later at the pharmacy in town, which still had a developing service, mostly used by elderly residents who hadn't transitioned to digital, and when she held the print up in the parking lot, she stood there for a long moment in the September wind. She gave it to him on a Thursday, tucked into the front cover of a book she was returning. He pulled it out and stood in his doorway and looked at it. Soot was sitting at his feet looking up at him. "That's a good picture," he said finally. "It is," she agreed. He looked at it a while longer. Then he said, "I'm going to put this on the wall." He had not put anything on the walls since Pauline. Adeline knew this because he'd mentioned it once, obliquely, and she had filed it without comment. "Good," she said simply. He put it up that evening in the hallway where the light was good, next to the hook where he hung his jacket. He stood back and looked at it for a while, Soot beside him. The photo showed exactly what he was now. A man in a field, his dog close by, the whole wide Montana sky above them. Not healed, exactly. That word was too clean, too complete, but moving. Forward, or at least in some direction that had more in it than standing still. By October, Heron's Fork had begun to take shape around him in a way it hadn't in the 3 years since he'd come back. He knew Doyle and Marge by habit now, by the rhythm of their comings and goings, by the sound of Doyle's truck turning onto the county road at 6:15 on the mornings he drove to the grain co-op. He knew Vivian Chung well enough to nod at her in the hardware store, and have her nod back with the warmth of someone who shared a particular knowledge with you. He knew the woman at Della's diner, who always brought his coffee without being asked, whose name turned out to be Ruth, and who had a granddaughter at the middle school, who was apparently some kind of prodigy at geography. He had not stopped being the man who moved through spaces quietly. He didn't think he ever would. But there was a difference now between moving quietly and moving alone, and it was a difference he felt most clearly in the evenings, sitting on his porch in the cooling air with Soot at his feet and the lights of the Fitch place visible through the trees to the west and the warm windows of Adeline's farmhouse to the east. He was, he supposed, surrounded. He hadn't decided how he felt about that, and then one evening he noticed that he felt fine about it, and he supposed that was the answer. Professor died on a Wednesday in late October. It was quiet, as Adeline had wanted. Vivian came to the farmhouse, and it was gentle and right, and Professor went in his own bed with his head in Adeline's hands, which was how he'd always fallen asleep. Leland sat with her on the porch afterward. He didn't try to fill the silence. He'd learned that silence wasn't something that needed filling, that sometimes the most useful thing a person could do was simply not leave. Soot climbed up onto the porch swing beside Adeline, which she had never done before, and leaned into her full weight the way she'd learned to lean into Leland's. And Adeline put her arm around the dog and held on. They sat there until it was fully dark and the stars came out, which in eastern Montana meant a sky that looked almost violent with light, the kind of sky that reminded you how large everything was, and how small, both at once. At some point Adeline said, "Thank you for staying. I wasn't going anywhere," Leland said. She looked at the stars. He looked at them too. "He was a good dog," Leland said. "The best," she said. "In the particular way that dogs are the best, which is completely and without reservation and every single day." He thought about that for a while. He thought about Soot in the culvert in January, pressing herself into the corner of the truck, going silent for 3 months while she decided whether the world was safe. He thought about her standing in the field with her face lifted to the sky and howling like something that had found its way back to itself. He had thought he was saving her. He knew better now. Some things arrive in your life and they do not ask your permission and they do not explain themselves. A dog in a ditch in January, a neighbor with a camera and a dying border collie. A retired vet who made stew and believed in things being sent, a retired road crewman who returned a socket wrench and stayed for years. None of it was the life he'd planned. None of it was the life he'd lost either. It was just the one he was living, and Soot was in it, pressed warm and solid against his leg on a cold night in October, and the stars were very bright, and that was enough. It was, he realized, considerably more than enough.